Chapter 14. The Chechen Wolves. Chechnya and Russia, a bloody history. The Chechens and Russians began spilling each other's blood as far back as the 18th century, when an expanding Russian state clawed its way southward into the Caucasus region on Russia's southern border. Russia's czars desperately wanted a warm water port, needed a land buffer against the still powerful Ottoman and Persian empires, and always looked to fill Russia's coffers by subjugating its neighbors. However, the warlike people of the Caucasus, like the Chechens, Dagestanis, and Circassians, refused to lay down for the invaders and fought a series of fierce wars against the Russian Empire for the next century and a half, from 1718 until 1864. The Chechen people may have been defeated by the vastly superior Russian forces in 1864, but whenever the opportunity presented itself, they rebelled against the hated occupiers and slaughtered the local Russian garrisons. Consequently, when the Russo-Turkish War broke out in 1877, the Chechens rebelled. They did so again during the Russian Revolution of 1905 and 1917, during the subsequent Russian Civil War, and then fought back against Stalin and his forced collectivization in the 1930s. Then a sustained insurgency was fought from 1940 to 1944, which peaked during the time the Germans absolutely ravaged Western Russia. But as soon as the German threat to Mother Russia was over, and Hitler's legions were blasted back into Poland and the Balkans, Stalin immediately went to work on the Chechen problem. Uncle Joe felt no pity for the Chechen guerrillas, or the Chechen people for that matter, and reasoned there could only be an insurgency in Chechnya if the Chechens still lived there. Starting in 1944, Stalin proceeded to cram the Chechens, all of them, into filthy cattle cars and ship them out across the frozen mountains expanses and tundra, the Kazakhstan and Siberia. No people, no insurgency. Stalin thought he solved the Chechen problem, but he only put it on ice for a few years. In 1953, Stalin was dead, and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, who was president in Stalingrad and helped promote the Red Army's successful sniperism campaign, charted a new course of de-Stalinization. In 1956, as part of this new period of thawing internal politics, the Chechens were allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild their lives, culture, and society. For the next 40 years, the Chechens were integrated into Russian society. Chechen children learned to speak Russian, Chechen men served in the Russian military, and lived in peace. However, one could also say the Chechens needed the 4 decades to recover as a people and to prepare for their next grasp at freedom. The chance came in 1991 when the Soviet system came crumbling to the ground like a terminally unstable brick wall. As Russia peered out from the rubble, they saw the demise of the Soviet Union was a dangerous event that could lead to politically instability in the region. The Russians were correct, because Chechnya immediately wanted to secede. Moscow was unwilling to sit idly by while Chechnya became an independent republic because it would set a dangerous precedent and threaten Russia's national oil infrastructure in the Caucasus. Both sides, unyielding in their diametrically opposed goals, careened towards each other like runaway trains. They were on a collision course for another war. War came in 1994 when Russia tried, through force of arms, to prevent Chechnya from becoming independent. The fighting raged from 1994 to 1996 until Russian President Boris Yeltsin declared a ceasefire and signed a peace treaty in 1997. This war was a particularly brutal one where captured Russian soldiers were decapitated and their lifeless heads propped up on wooden stakes as a warning to their comrades. Other prisoners taken by the Chechens were killed on video, their throats sliced open, their last desperate seconds of life splashed all over the internet, and the film sent to their parents' homes. A new chapter in modern warfare was written as the seriously outnumbered Chechen rebels took a page out of the Stalingrad book and used the urban terrain of the nation's capital, Grozny, which ironically is Russian for the word foreboding, to inflict huge numbers of casualties on the poorly led, poorly organized, unmotivated Russian conscript army. In some cases, entire Russian columns were ambushed and wiped out to the last man, blown up with volleys of RPGs and gunned down by Chechen snipers who seemed to be everywhere. In 1997, peace treaty was short-lived as Chechen forces invaded neighboring Dagestan in 1999 and were then accused of setting off several massive explosions in Russia, which destroyed a series of apartment buildings, slaughtering hundreds. With these events providing ample pretext for a second invasion, Russian forces fought their way into Chechnya again in 1999. This time, Russia was better organized and prepared for an all-out war. In a relatively short period of time, the Russian forces cleared out most of the country of organized resistance by using massive doses of aerial bombs and artillery barrages, intermixed with a liberal sprinkling of fuel-air explosives and cruise missiles. By 2005, the invading Russian troops steamrolled large-scale Chechen resistance, but were now stuck in a low-grade guerrilla war with no end in sight. Overall, these recent Chechen wars were costly, with an estimated 15,000 Russian soldiers and up to 100,000 Chechens killed either through direct combat, exposure, starvation, or disease. Considering Chechnya had an estimated pre-war population of only 1.1 million people, these losses were enormous. Training and equipping the Chechen sniper. Despite their inevitable defeat, the Chechen fighters made combat operations in their breakaway republic dangerous for Russian soldiers, as can be attested by the deluge of casualties filling the Russian morgues and hospitals. The high casualty rate was due in part to the Chechen snipers, who were employed on a large scale, integrated at the lowest unit levels, and used in all their operations. In fact, one would be hard-pressed to find any other guerrilla movement that employed snipers to such great effect and in such large numbers. One reason for the Chechen guerrillas' affinity for sniping was their embedded gun culture. Chechen men admired guns and saw them as a symbol of power and prosperity. Because Chechen men loved their weapons, they were skilled in both their use and maintenance at an early age, and everyone had them. This cultural affinity was further reinforced by the training so many Chechen men received when they served in the Russian military. This combination of a skilled manpower pool and the widespread availability of sniper rifles resulted in a guerrilla movement with a high concentration of competent snipers. Also, the Chechens were a military-savvy culture because most Chechen males served in the Russian military due to universal conscription. For example, deceased Chechen President Dudayev was a general in the Russian army, and subsequent, and also deceased, Chechen President Asian Maskhadov was a colonel. Guerrilla leader extraordinaire Shamil Basayev, deceased, served 2 years in the Soviet military before waging his personal, decade-long jihad against the Russian invaders. Chechnya was not unique in this aspect, as other republics of the former Soviet Union, like the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, had similar demographics, with many of their own citizens trained in Soviet weapons and tactics. Training in the former Soviet army was just one way for the Chechen guerrillas to get a trained sniper. There were other ways as well. Since Chechnya was an Islamic country and many guerrilla organizations in Chechnya were explicitly Islamic in nature, Chechens were welcomed in foreign training camps like the Amir Muwayya training camp in Afghanistan. One side of the country, Chechen guerrillas trained freely in all the art of guerrilla warfare, to include the discipline of sniping. The Russian military may have been able to hamper the Chechens' ability to train in their own country, but the Russian government certainly could not stop Chechens from training in foreign sanctuaries like Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Iraq. The Chechens did not always have to leave their country to get good training. They could import this training from abroad. Shamil Basayev did just this when he hired Saudi-born Amir Khattab, aka the Black Arab, and his crew of Afghani veterans to come to Chechnya as consultants in February 1995 to train the Chechen guerrillas. Once in Chechnya, Khattab built his own training camps, to include one called the Training Center of the Armed Forces of the Chechen Republic of Ikaria, which opened in September 1996. Ironically, the Russians unknowingly helped set up this training camp years before, when it was created as a Soviet youth pioneer camp. Now, this former youth camp was transformed into a guerrilla university that churned out guerrilla fighters, many trained in sniping, who were bent on killing Russian soldiers. While training a Chechen guerrilla sniper could be an inconvenience, securing good sniper rifles to kill Russians with was much easier. When the Russian military pulled out of Chechnya in 1992, they left behind some 533 SVD sniper rifles for their future enemies. The same Russian-made, Russian serial-numbered sniper weapons, after being turned over to the Chechen military, were subsequently used to kill and wound thousands of Russian soldiers from 1994 until the present. In this respect, the Russians must look to themselves as to why and how Chechen snipers were able to call their ranks at such a fearsome rate. Beyond these sniper rifles left behind, battlefield recovery was another means for Chechen guerrillas to secure the most current Russian sniper rifles. Throughout the Chechen Wars, Chechen guerrillas regularly captured Russian soldiers and their accompanying equipment in combat. If the Russians they captured and killed had modern sniper rifles, the Chechen guerrillas now had these same sniper weapons. But why should the Chechen guerrillas take the risk of getting killed or captured just to secure the latest Russian sniper rifles? It was easier to buy them on the black market, either in Chechnya or from the gun runners profiting from the war and the relative safety and comfort of neighboring Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Georgia. If the Chechens had a few $1,000s, they had millions, they could buy the latest and greatest Russian sniper rifles in any quantity they desired. If nuclear waste and other radioactive materials could be bought on the black market in Grozny, as documented in 1992, purchasing a sniper rifle was like buying a loaf of bread. Often, the Chechen guerrillas cut out the middleman and bought the weapons they needed directly from the source, from the Russians themselves. Since the Russian military was so thoroughly corrupt, there were opportunities to buy all kinds of weapons from the Russian officers and soldiers they were actually fighting. Some Russians had no problem making a profit to help their families enrich themselves or to support a drug habit at the expense of other Russian soldiers' lives. Even former Soviet republics like Belarus contributed to the guerrillas' war chest, selling the Chechens the latest in weaponry. For the independent states of the defunct Soviet Union, selling weapons to Chechnya was a double bonus. The seller not only made a tidy profit, but the buyer promised to kill their former masters as quickly and ruthlessly as possible. Chechen sniper tactics. Unlike some guerrilla movements, the Chechens believed the sniper was a key building block for a successful war against the Russian occupation. In fact, the basic Chechen 8-man squad had a sniper assigned to it. This organization was much different from conventional military forces like those of America, Russia, and Britain, which do not assign snipers at the squad level, but prefer to keep them consolidated at higher levels, such as in a battalion sniper element. Because the Chechens viewed sniper as a basic asset, not a specialized tool used for high-value targets or special operations, they were everywhere. While most squads had a sniper, the Chechens were flexible in their tactics, employing the sniper at even low levels like 4-man cells organized with a sniper, a machine gunner, an RPG gunner, and an AK-47 armed rifleman. These teams used the sniper and machine gunner to pin down Russian soldiers, while the RPG gunner took out the Russians' armor. Additionally, any number of these cells could work together as needed to engage larger Russian forces with their combined firepower. Another Chechen tactic was to employ a single sniper with a supporting 4-man element. After the sniper fired, the support element distracted the targeted Russian soldiers, allowing the sniper to displace. This same support element then pinned down any Russian counterattacks, whether they were armored or dismounted. The goal here was for the sniper to survive and make another kill another day. While Chechen snipers worked as part of squads and cells, they also routinely worked in 2-man teams or even independently. Working in such small elements reduced the sniper's operational signature, allowing them to slip in between Russian units and behind Russian front lines. Once a Chechen sniper infiltrated in between two separate Russian units, they could pick off Russian soldiers from different groups, enticing them to fight each other, resulting in fratricide. These small elements also benefit in other ways from operating in close proximity to Russian positions because of the Russians' own tactics. Since the Russian military was dependent on massive, indiscriminate firepower to kill these snipers, they had to kill themselves. Although it seemed counterintuitive, the more closely Chechen snipers intermixed with the Russian forces, the safer they were. Decapitation tactics. In their war with the Russians, the Chechens made every shot count. Consequently, Chechen snipers were savvy as to whom they targeted. When the Chechen snipers took their shot, they concentrated on high-value targets like Russian officers, opposing snipers, machine gunners, and drivers. This specific targeting was designed to eliminate the key components enabling the Russian military machine to function in combat. The Chechens reasoned if the serpent's head was cut off, the rest of the body would flounder aimlessly. This theory was sound, since the Chechen snipers' intentional targeting of the Russian command structure had significant effects on the Russian forces at the tactical level. Some Russian soldiers noted during the 1994 through 95 battle for Grozny, there were very few platoon leaders and company commanders left to lead them. This high loss of lower-ranking officers meant Russian combat operations were disrupted from the bottom up. After all, who was going to lead a platoon and company attack for the leaderless Russian forces, conscripts and junior non-commissioned officers. The decapitation of the Russian leadership resulted in the headless Russian giant becoming paralyzed in the Grozny meat grinder, leading to even higher casualties. This targeting of key personnel led to the January 18, 2000 death of Russian Major General Mikhail Malofeyev as he inspected his force's frontline position in the northwestern section of Grozny. Unofficial sources from the Russian Joint Command Group in Chechnya reported the general was shot and killed by a Chechen sniper as he made his rounds. Then, due to the continued intensity of Chechen sniper fire in that sector, Russian troops were unable to get to him for days. It was not until January 23rd that Russian forces were able to recover General Malofeyev's bloated, bullet-riddled body and give him a decent burial. Chechen sniper martyrs. Chechen snipers always manipulated the urban terrain to give them an advantage over the numerically superior Russian forces. One favorite Chechen sniper tactic was to position themselves in high-rise buildings dominated the approaches to the city. These snipers positioned themselves deep in a room where they took their shot. They were invisible. The targeted Russian soldiers never saw the muzzle flash of the sniper killing them. These methods allowed a few Chechen snipers to pin down entire Russian units while extricating a rising toll from the Russian infantry. Because of the extreme angle the Chechen snipers fired from, the Russians' return fire could not reach them. In addition, many of these Chechen snipers were sniper martyrs on a suicide mission where they picked off Russian soldiers until the building the snipers occupied was obliterated by Russian tanks and helicopter gunships. These sniper martyrs could not be outmaneuvered or flushed out. They had to be killed or they would continue killing. In January and February 2000, Russian forces fought for weeks just to make Minuka Square, located in the center of Grozny. Chechen snipers pinned down Russian assault groups near the square for days on end, stalling the entire Russian attack to clear the city's center. Again, Chechen sniper martyrs barricaded in the upper stories of tall buildings had excellent view of Russian troop movements while the snipers remained invisible. Even after Russian forces called in a steady stream of airstrikes on their positions, the shooters remained holed up in their sniper hides. If the snipers were located in the floors several stories down from the actual roof of the building, it took several direct hits from the Russian aerial bombs to blast through the upper levels and set them. The Chechen sniper, a technical shooter. Chechen snipers in general were very good shots, as one Russian soldier found out as he recuperated in a Russian Interior Ministry hospital. This soldier, with shattered leg bones, was walking at night when a Chechen sniper shot him. As any experienced shooter can tell you, making an accurate shot in the dark against a moving target is no easy feat. Also, Chechen snipers habitually made successful headshots against Russian soldiers, another difficult prospect requiring some technical ability. In fact, headshots were a preferred tactic for Chechen snipers. At night, Russian soldiers sometimes gave their positions away by lighting a cigarette. Alert Chechen snipers would see the flame from the lighter or cigarette embers and aim in on this light source, hitting the Russian soldiers in the head or neck, most often resulting in instant death or mortal wound. Since many frontline Russian soldiers wore body armor for protection, Chechen snipers learned to work around the problem. Russian soldier Nikolay Aldakov experienced this firsthand as he tried to save a wounded comrade during a gun battle. As he dragged away the wounded soldier, a Chechen sniper saw him and shot him twice in the back in his body armor. The sniper readjusted his aim and then shot Nikolay in the legs. In another incident, as Private Kuzin was on guard duty wearing his assigned body armor, a Chechen sniper also aimed for his legs. Since Kuzin was standing with his arms by his sides, the bullet struck his hand instead. Intentionally shooting Russian soldiers in the legs does several things. First, it solves the problem of avoiding protective body armor. Second, it drops a soldier to the ground, forcing other soldiers to come to their rescue who then become targets themselves. In other words, a soldier shot in the legs becomes human bait. And third, because a soldier with a leg injury cannot walk off the battlefield, it stresses the Russians' medical support capabilities because it takes several men to carry a wounded man long distances and will eventually require a vehicle for transport. This is an identical philosophy to the Russians' own sport of sambo, where combatants focus on leg, knee, and ankle attacks in order to disable their opponent. The theory is a man who cannot walk is an even bigger burden to his comrades. To the Russians' dismay, Chechen snipers proved capable of making long-distance shots. In one instance, a Russian Oman soldier serving in Grozny was eating an afternoon meal with his comrades when a hidden Chechen sniper shot him. The sniper was an estimated 1,000 meters away when he pulled the trigger, striking the Oman soldier in the back. He died 10 minutes later. At this distance, the bullet ripped through the soldier's body before anyone even heard the gunshot. The stricken soldier's comrades had no idea where the shot came from, and they ended up trying to destroy every building in 1 kilometer radius just to get the sniper. They did not know if they got the shooter or not. Guerrilla tactics. While some Chechen snipers operated as members of organized units openly warring with Russian forces, others lived among the population. Chechen guerrilla leader Shamil Basav noted in early 2000 he and his men were taking too many casualties fighting the Russians one-on-one, so he ordered his men to disband and take to the villages. In the villages, the guerrillas blended in with the Chechen people, so effectively, Russian units had no idea of the true number of guerrillas they were facing. Fighting this way meant many things for the Chechen snipers who previously slugged it out with the superior Russian forces. Now the Chechen snipers had to hide their sniper rifles in or near their villages so Russian soldiers could not find them. This also meant the guerrillas could no longer openly wear the mix of Russian field uniforms they had been fighting in. Now they had to dress and lead lives like the other civilians. More importantly, the Chechen guerrillas also had to defeat the investigative measures the Russian forces used to separate them from the real civilians. A successful investigation by Russian forces was no joking matter, as the resulting arrest was sure to be followed with brutal interrogations, a starvation diet, exposure to the elements, and a strong likelihood of death. Russian investigative measures did not have to be sophisticated and included soldiers looking for bruises on suspecting Chechens' shoulders. This is because people repeatedly shooting high-powered rifles, or RPGs for that matter, may get bruising from the recoil that slams the butt of the weapon into the pocket of the firer's shoulder. The Russians also use specially trained dogs to sniff suspected guerrillas for anything from gunpowder residue to traces of high explosives. Another constant threat for the guerrilla civilian were informants who provided information for either the Russians or the despised pro-Moscow Chechen government. These informants were motivated for a variety of reasons: money, clan or blood feuds, personal advancement, religious animosity, and everything in between. A strategy of long-term attrition through sniping. The Chechen rebel leadership firmly believed if they inflicted a steady stream of casualties against the Russian armed forces, the Russian domestic public would eventually tire of the war. One observer of the war noted, while the Russians concentrated on securing territory, the Chechens aimed to inflict Russian casualties and extend the conflict. Chechen leadership sought to cause 100 Russian casualties daily. The Chechens believed if they could continue the war and inflict high Russian casualties, Russia would eventually pull out. For the Chechens, the widespread employment of snipers was a tool to generate this steady stream of Russian casualties. One could argue this sniper attrition strategy was effective to a degree because a study covering the period from July 1995 to April 1996 revealed the Russians suffered up to 5 killed and another dozen wounded every day. At this rate, the Russians were losing 1,825 killed and 4,380 wounded a year. However, it was believed by many close observers of the war these casualty rates were absurdly low, intentionally deflated by a Russian government desperate to keep a positive spin on the war. A reporter interviewing wounded Russian soldiers in a hospital during the Russian drive for Grozny in 2000 found the truth about casualties to be different from the government's official statements. One wounded Russian soldier, shot by a Chechen sniper as he tried to rescue a comrade, said it succinctly, "The snipers are good. We lost many casualties." Another soldier in the same hospital said, "It's a guerrilla war now. The Chechens know the territory very well, even in territory that we've liberated. The Chechens are civilians by day, but fighters by night. We suffered hundreds of casualties, but then on TV they say we only lost 4 or 5. Author Arthur L. Speyer III noted Chechen snipers were the second largest producer of Russian casualties overall, and when Chechen guerrillas faced pure Russian infantry units, Chechen snipers were the #1 casualty producer. The Chechen sniper campaign not only chipped away at Russian troops' strength, it caused fear, uncertainty, and terror. Russian soldiers patrolling Grozny's churned-up streets or the dirt roads in the local villages had no idea where the next anonymous bullet would come from. No matter what you did, nobody was safe. More importantly, the Chechen guerrillas' widespread and effective employment of snipers had significant psychological effects on their Russian enemies, far beyond the immediate effects of the Russian soldiers shipped home to Moscow in body bags. The unseen casualties, Chechen snipers, and Russian combat stress. The brutal fighting in Chechen cities like Grozny, where guerrilla snipers operated on a large scale, was the ideal environment for producing combat stress-related disorders in Russian soldiers. In fact, V.S. Novikov, a major general in the Russian medical services, researched Russian combat stress in Chechnya and published the results in his article, Psychophysiological Support of Combat Activities of Military Personnel. Novikov's research was based on a sample of 1,312 Russian soldiers who previously served in Chechnya. Novikov found a large portion of these soldiers, 72% to be exact, showed some type of psychological disorder symptom to include insomnia, depression, deterioration of moral values, and focusing intently on self-interest and the lack of the capability to care about others' physical, moral, or emotional sense with a marked disregard for standard social values. In other words, the war was producing sociopaths. Novikov is not alone in his assessment, as another estimate of Russian Chechen War veterans for the period March 1997 through March 1998 found that 10,000 Russian soldiers required psychological help. Alexander Kucher, a Russian military psychologist, published Life After Military Service, a study that found nearly 35,000 Russian veterans of Chechnya and their families received psychological counseling since 1996. The psychological trauma of fighting in Chechnya was so prevalent, other Russian authors labeling returning Russian soldiers as murderers, rapists, marauders, sex perverts, and abnormal people who could not re-enter the workforce until they were fixed. The Russian Veterans Advocacy Group, Union of Committees of Mothers of Russian Soldiers, said as many as 50% of Chechen veterans returning from the war plagued Russian society with violent crimes like rape, murder, and armed robbery. One soldier interviewed for a documentary about Chechen war veterans was captured by Chechen guerrillas and held captive in a hole for 6 months until he escaped. This soldier was since arrested in Russia and was serving a 15-year sentence in a work camp after raping a 10-year-old girl. When this soldier was initially arrested and held in jail, of the other 19 inmates in his cell, 5 were Chechen war veterans and 1 an Afghanistan war veteran.